Welcome to this WiseOwl tutorial on basic transformations in SQL Server Integration Services. Here's what you'll learn on the tutorial. We'll first look at our example package importing data from Excel into SQL Server. We'll then look at how to create a sorting transformation to sort rows, an aggregate transformation to group data together. We'll look at how to create row and percentage sampling transformations, how to combine data from two or more different sources using a union all transformation, and I'll explain about synchronous and asynchronous transformations. So let's get started. Before I begin showing you about transformations, let's look at our basic example package. We're going to take an Excel workbook of winners of the X Factor series. You can see there's 9 series, and for each series there's a winner. There's the start and the finish date of the series and what gender they are. And we're going to export that into a SQL Server table so that the end result looks like this. We'll have the 9 winners, and if you look at the design of that table, you can see I've made a couple of simplifications. I've made both the winner and the gender, the two text fields, NVARCHAR, which means Unicode characters, with up to 255 characters in. And the reason I've done that is to make sure I don't have any issues importing data from Excel. In a later tutorial in this series, we'll look at how to relax those constraints and how to do data conversion so the data imports successfully into just a normal varchar field. But that's for a later date. So returning to the issue at hand, I've got a basic package set up which consists of 2 control flow tasks. The first one is a simple SQL command. And what it does is deletes any rows from the TBL series table we've got so that it can re-import them afresh. And if I double click on that and have a look, you can see the command it's running is delete from the table. The second control flow task is the data flow one, which will do the importing. So it imports the rows from the Excel workbook into the series table. And if I double click on that to have a look at it, you can see it has a source, which is a list of X Factor series competitions, and it has a destination, which is a table of series in SQL Server. And if I now run this package, you can see that it will successfully complete. And if I then close that down, or rather stop it running, and go into SQL Server, if I refresh my table, I'm going to ask you to believe that it has deleted the records and re-imported them successfully, because that's actually what's happened. So now that I've established what my basic package is, what I'm going to do is go about adding a transformation into it. The first transformation I'm going to add is a sort transform, which will simply sort the data. And I can find it in the common transformations. It's clearly not something you'll want to do very often because it's so much more easily done either in Excel or SQL Server or another application, but it's a good first transformation to show you. I've got my source, I've got my destination. My transformation needs to sit between the two. So what I'm going to have to do is break the link between the two by deleting it, and then add in my sort transformation and reconnect up my pipework. So I'm going to drag the successful data from the source into the transform, and I'm going to drag the successful data from the transform into the destination. So it's just like an intermediate stage which data will flow through. I'm going to rename it as sort X Factor series. And you can see at the moment there's a red cross because I haven't specified what I'm sorting by. So I can remedy that by double clicking on the transformation, which as usual is the way to edit a task, and I can specify what I want to sort by. I'm going to sort them by gender first, and then within gender by the name of the winner. Now in the incredibly unlikely event there's 2 people of the same gender and the same winner's name, I'm then going to subsort them by the series number. And you can see the priority order 1, 2, 3 for those sort fields. Now the start date and the finish date I want to pass through my transformation. If I had unticked those, what would happen is they wouldn't be available to store in my final SQL Server table. So I'm going to make sure that even though I'm not sorting by those, I include them as the output from the transformation. So I can choose OK to confirm that. All the red crosses disappear, and I should be in a position now to run that. And what should happen is that my SQL Server table will contain exactly the same records, if I stop that and have a look at it. But you can see they're sorted differently. All the females come first, followed by the males. The females are sorted in alphabetical order, as are the males. As I said, sorting is not something you commonly do in integration services. Particularly, it's an example of something called an asynchronous transformation, which means it runs quite slowly. More on that towards the end of this tutorial. So now we've had a look at sorting, let's go on to have a look at another transformation, aggregating. Before working on my aggregation, I need to firstly get rid of some of my old bits of my data flow task. So I'm going to get rid of the sorting transform and also the destination. So I've just got the Excel workbook source. Now what my aggregation is going to do is take the data and aggregate it according to whether people were male or female. So the end result will be female, and next to that I'll show the number of winners, which is 3, and then male, and next to that I'll show the number of winners, which is 6. Instead of counting, you can also sum, average, perform standard deviations, and a number of other statistics as well. Now before we continue to add our aggregate transformation, it's worth saying that this too is something you won't often do in integration services, because it's normally much quicker to do it in either SQL, Excel, Access, Oracle, whatever you may be working with. But that said, let's add an aggregation task in, aggregation transformation, and what I'll do is feed the output from the Excel workbook into the transformation. And then I'll rename it to say what it's going to do, which is to count the series by gender. There's a red cross next to it because at the moment it's not actually outputting anything. So to remedy that, I can edit the task and I can say what I want it to do. Firstly, I'm going to group it by gender. And secondly, I'm going to count how many series there are for each gender. I'm going relatively quickly through this because most people will have seen this either in Excel, Access or SQL Server. You can see, having grouped by gender, I can perform a number of different statistics. What I'm going to do is to count how many series there are. It also makes sense to change the output alias, the name of this output column. And I'm going to call it number of series, because that's what it actually is. So if I then choose OK, my red cross will disappear, and I could now run this package, but it would be hard to tell what it was actually doing. Now I don't want to go to all the trouble of creating a SQL Server table just to hold the output from this, so I'm going to do a common little cheat and add a union all transformation. What this is usually used to do is to combine the results of two different tables, but it can also be used to mop up data as a final stage in your data flow. So what I can do is connect the results of the aggregation straight into the union all, and in order to be able to see what's actually going on with this, because the data will be lost as soon as the package finishes executing, I'm going to add a data viewer, so that as the data flows out of the transformation of the aggregation and into the union all, I'll be able to monitor it to see whether it's working successfully. So if I now try running that package, what I hope we're going to see is a data viewer popping up containing what's actually going on. And you can see there that at this stage, you can see two rows giving aggregation of the number of series by gender. So that's all working successfully. So I can close that down and stop my package running. So that's how aggregation works. What I'm now going to do is take a less common transform, which is row sampling and maybe percentage sampling as well. Now in order to be able to do this, I'm going to have to get rid of my aggregate transformation, so bye-bye to that, and also my union all one as well. What row sampling and percentage sampling allow you to do is to take the full set of data and sample either a given number of rows or a given percentage of it. So for example, I could say show me 3 randomly chosen rows, or I could say show me the 10% of the randomly chosen rows. So let's do an example of each of those. I'll start with showing 3 randomly selected rows. The reason you might want to do this is either to check the integrity of your data, or to prepare a sample of data to feed into a data mining algorithm in analysis services. So I'm going to add in my row sampling transformation, and I'm going to change the name of it to say, sample 3 rows. And I'm going to feed the Excel source into that, and then configure it to say what it's going to do. So I'm going to say how many rows I'm going to choose, and the answer is 3. The random number seed at the bottom allows you, as it says in this description at the bottom, to generate the same random data every time that you run the package. But to me that's not really very random, so I'm going to untick it and leave integration services to decide itself how to choose random data. There's 2 outputs from this. There's the rows I've actually selected, so I'm going to call that selected rows. And there's the rows I haven't selected, which I'm going to imaginatively call unselected rows. So what it will do is automatically divide the data into 2 parts. If I then choose OK, what I then need to do is map those 2 parts somewhere, and I'm going to use the same trick I chose previously, which is to create a union all transformation, and in fact I'm going to have 2, as will become apparent in a second. So I'll call the first one selected data, and I'll call the second one unselected data. Now when I map the output from the sampling transform into one of the 2 union all destinations, as it were, it will ask me which of the 2 different outputs I want to take. So I'm going to take the selected rows and feed them into my selected data, and I'm going to drag my unselected rows into my unselected data transform. And you can see that Integration Services puts a little caption on each of the data flows to show that the data has been split into 2 parts. Now I'm not going to be able to see what's happening unless I put in a data viewer on each of the 2 data flows, so that's what I'll do. And then if we run this package, you will see 2 windows pop up. One of them, this one, will contain the 3 rows I've randomly selected: Steve Brookstein, Shane Ward and Matt Cardle. The other one will contain the 6 rows which haven't been selected. Now what I'm going to do is close those 2 down and rerun my package. And the second time round, you can see it's selected different people. So every time you run it, it will select random people. So that's what a row transform does, a sampling row does. What we could also do is select data by percentage. So if I delete that task to sample my 3 rows and replace it with percentage sampling. And what we'll do is sample the top, or rather 10%. So as before, I can feed the Excel workbook data into that transform. I can configure it so that my 2 outputs are called selected data and unselected data. And I'm going to take 10% of the rows in my selected data and then choose OK. And then I need to connect up the outputs. So the selected data is going to go into the selected data transform, and the unselected data is going to go into the unselected data transform. Once more, I need to add in a data viewer on each of these 2 data flows, and then when I run this package, I should get pretty much the same results, but the difference will be that the selected data contains 2 rows and the unselected data contains the other 7 rows. There's a little bit of a puzzle to me quite how Excel can decide that 10% of 9 is actually showing 2 rows, but I think that's a result of having such a small amount of data. It doesn't really make sense to sample 10% of 9 rows. So that's how row sampling and percentage sampling work. So what I'm going to do as before is delete all my extra bits of this data flow task, and what we'll now do is have a look at combining 2 sets of data together using a union all transform again. The example we're going to create is going to be to combine the male contestants, which I put in a separate spreadsheet called males, and the female ones I put in a separate spreadsheet called females. And what I'm going to do is use a union all transformation to combine both these two sets of data into one single one. So what I actually need to do is get rid of my existing Excel source and add two new sources. And I'm going to use the source assistant to do that. So let's start with the male contestants. Sorry, to go with males first. I'm using the current Excel connection manager. I'm going to call it males for short. And I'm going to edit it so that it's taking the information from the males sheet. And if I preview that, you can see it's bringing in the 6 male contestants. Now what I'm going to do is add a females source following exactly the same rules. And the only difference is this is going to be taking its data from the female sheet, and there's the 3 females. So I've got 2 different sources coming in, and what I need to do is to combine them together. And I can do that using the handy union all transformation, which corresponds to the SQL statement union. So I'm going to call this combine genders, and I can drag the output from the males into that, and I can drag the output from the females into that too. But I'm actually going to make it slightly more interesting by first choosing to rename some of my columns in each of these 2 Excel sources. So let's start with the males. There's the columns being output, and what I'm going to do is change the name of the column coming out of this from winner to male winner. And then I'm going to do a similar thing with the females, and for the columns on the females I'm going to change the name of the output column from this to female winner. You can see that if I move the mouse. If I then direct the outputs into my union all, when I configure this, it's going to ask me how to map my columns. Now for 4 of the 5 columns there's no problems. So in the males and the female is both called series, start date, finish date and gender, and so there's no problem mapping those onto the final columns. But for the winner I've got to actually specifically say which of the columns I'm going to map onto the final destination. So I'm going to take the male winner column from the males and the female winner column from the females, and those will map onto the winner column in the final table. So then I can choose OK. What I can now do is take the results of my union all transformation and feed them into my SQL Server table. So I'll add in a destination for that. I'll configure it to use the connection I've already created. I'll rename it as series table. I'll drag the output from the union all transformation into that table, and then I just need to configure it to say that it's going into the table called TBL series, and then I can choose OK. Now I've still got the red cross because the input columns can't be 0, so what I need to do is double click on that, go into the mappings and map the start date and the finish date up, and then choose OK. If I now run this package, I hope to see that it will combine the 2 sets of data together in the single union all transformation and export those rows into the final table. And the numbers tell the story here. There's 6 rows going down this pipe, 3 rows going down this one, but 9 rows going down the final pipe. And if I now go to SQL Server and have a look at my output from this, you can see the data's been imported in the correct order, first the males and then the females. So that's what a union all transformation does. It combines data from 2 or more different tables. So what I'm going to do is stop debugging and just briefly explain now about synchronous and asynchronous transformations. To explain synchronous and asynchronous transformations, let's consider this Excel workbook. We want to work out the name or the length of the name of each winner, so I put in an Excel function called len, and when I press return there, it will give me 11, because that's how many characters are in Leona Lewis's name. If I then want to set up a transformation in integration services to do a similar thing, it will work on a row-by-row basis, and at any one point in time it could be working on a single isolated row, and this data could be held in memory. This is called a synchronous transformation. Most transformations are synchronous and will run very quickly. The alternative, if I could just get rid of that column now, is to sort it. Now if I'm sorting data, what I will do is have to take a copy of that, paste it into another area of memory, and then sort within that area of memory. And this is called a fully blocking asynchronous transformation. It's asynchronous because it can't work on each row in isolation, and it's fully blocking because it will take up another entire set of memory. I realise this is a non-technical explanation, but the main thing to note is to avoid doing things like sorting and aggregating if you possibly can, because they will run more slowly. As it happens, there's a slight difference between the two. Sorting is, as I said, a fully blocking asynchronous transformation, whereas things like aggregating and union all are what's called partially blocking asynchronous transformations. They won't be able to work on one row at a time, but they don't use quite as much memory. And that completes this tutorial on all the basic transformations available in integration services. The next tutorial will look at variables in detail. I hope you've enjoyed this WiseOwl tutorial on basic transformations. To find much more training resources, go to www.wiseowl.co.uk.